So fast forward to the economic crisis. What has the role been in race in this economic crisis, and how do we look at history to really understand what the impacts have been? One, as I mentioned earlier, communities of color are often hurt first and hardest hit. And in times of crisis is a glaring example of a trends that happen in not times of crisis. So when you look to the Great Depression, it was much more likely to be laid off or lose a business. And that there was also a widening of gap between the rich and poor during the Great Depression. Today, like I said earlier, really what undergirded this economic crisis was the ways in which the predatory lending market was allowed to happen because of deregulation that happened in the 90s, right? Because of that, many of these communities of color did not have access to wealth traditionally over the course of our history because of, like I said, redlining. These communities were particularly targeted during this predatory lending scheme, which didn't just hurt communities of color, although hurt them particularly badly. There are statistics that we found that have shown that it didn't matter what class people were. Many black upper class communities were the most targeted. So it's not just about class, about people having no money, no options, not reading the fine lines. Oftentimes, because of the ways that these predatory lending schemes were happening, they were actually targeting high communities of a lot of people of color, regardless of class. And had we paid attention to that, we would have known and we would have prevented the crisis, which really ended up rocking our entire financial structure and has led us into the mess that we're in now. So on the issue of blame, and this is really around what is the public conversation then around race in situations like the economic crisis. During the Great Depression, illegal immigration from Europe and places like Mexico were blamed for many of the loss of jobs, et cetera. And it really led to mass deportations. In fact, 40,000 immigrants from Mexico who some of them had lived here their entire lives back when Texas used to be Mexico, were deported. Today, you hear a lot of this rhetoric around immigrants stealing jobs and services from regular Americans, or the fact that they're to blame for these, for the economic crisis and this stuff around Acorn. A lot of that is really just shifting blame to communities of color and scapegoating them. And then lastly, when we think about this economic recovery, so like I said, many of these public policies during the New Deal often left communities of color out, which really just ended up creating a widening gap and a more insecure economy for the future. When we look at the stimulus programs today, we have to think about how are these programs investing in communities of color. This is one of the big areas of work that we have at the Center for Social Inclusion, is really trying to show and record how is this money hitting communities of color, is it or is it not? One of the big challenges that we're facing is that the data is not getting collected. Oftentimes we don't know who's getting the jobs by race or even location. They'll tell us who received the money, which will then re-grant it, but we don't know where the projects are happening. So if we can't map this stuff across communities and across race, then we don't even know how the impacts are going to hit. And if we don't invest in those communities that were the most vulnerable to begin with, then we will not recover fully and become a thriving economy and country. So a few statistics around Texas. So you all may know this information, but I was pretty shocked to find that Texas is actually one of the most economically unequal states in the country. The gap between the state's richest and poorest families is the 9th largest in the nation. In the last decade, the top 20% of income earners experienced a 9% growth, compared to a negative 1.8% growth for the bottom 20%. 12 of the 15 states most impacted by the recession have a higher than average percentage of people of color, and this includes Texas. And I should say about the earlier statistic around the unequal states, a vast majority of the highest and most unequal states in the country have higher than average percentages of people of color. And so when I say that race often drives inequality for all, this is what I mean. And another statistic, 24% of Texas is uninsured, but more so for African Americans, which 28% of are uninsured, and 38% of Latinos are uninsured, compared to only 16% of non-Hispanic whites. So one thing that we like to do at Center for Social Inclusion, which we really like to create tools that are helpful for communities to really make the case for how communities of color are affected, and then thus what solutions need to be fashioned to address them. So one piece of the toolbox that we like to use is opportunity mapping. How can we show across space using GIS mapping where opportunity structures exist, whether it be in jobs, housing, education, etc., and where communities of color exist, to paint the picture of something that perhaps we already know, but have to show in order to prove to policymakers what's happening. So one of our an organization that does a lot of the similar work that we're very close to is the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State University, and they did a project here in Austin around what are the opportunity structures and how are communities of color positioned. So this map shows, it's a little bit small, I apologize, but the lighter the color, the light color signal where there are low concentrations, what they did is they mapped opportunity across Austin. The darker the area, the richer the community is in opportunity. So they did this across several indicators: jobs, education, housing, environment, neighborhood services. And so it's pretty obvious to see that a lot of the high opportunity areas actually lie west of I-35. East of I-35, not so good. Well, 60% of Latinos and African Americans are concentrated in low or very low opportunity census tracts compared to only 39% of whites. Two out of three African American and Latino children actually live in these low opportunity areas. When they mapped where low-income housing tax credit housing was being built, only 1 out of 10 of these houses were being built in high opportunity areas. 9 out of 10 were being built in low opportunity areas. And so these maps help us think about what are the policies that we're already fashioning that invest our taxpayer dollars to create opportunities, and are they really creating the opportunities we want them to create? Because if we place people who already don't have high opportunity scores on housing in places with bad transportation, bad access to jobs, bad schools, then really does that help them escape the cycle? So here's a map that we created on Houston, Texas. The darker the green, the higher percentage of people of color. The very darkest is more than 70% people of color neighborhoods. And the lighter is lower percent non-white. And the very lightest is less than 20%. So I actually have never been to Houston, although I'd like to go. So I'm not so familiar with the geography of this, so I can only know it by a map. But as you can see, the red dots indicate where job centers are, concentration of job centers. One job equals 1,000 dots. And as you can see, one dot equals 1,000 jobs. That's right. Thank you. The majority, it's disproportionate that the red dots are located in areas that have less concentrations of people of color. Well, what does this mean? It means that, one, chances are the housing stock in the areas that are less high opportunity or have less access to job centers are not worth as much as the other areas, which contributes to their ability to create wealth in their families, but also just in terms of accessing jobs. I found some statistics that show that the average or the median household income in 2008 for Houston is very stark across race. The average non-Hispanic white household makes $70,000 a year versus only $32,000 a year for a black household, $34,000 a year for a Hispanic or Latino household, and $51,000 a year for Asian households. And it's no coincidence that the way that we physically create opportunity structures, like where housing is and where jobs are, has everything to do with that. So we're coming upon probably a big immigration debate in this country. It's going to be messy, people. And oftentimes, a lot of the rhetoric we hear, and I'm sure that Texas is very much positioned in the middle of this, being a border state and having a very large proportion of Latino immigrants and native-born Latinos, that it's often a wedge issue for communities. And we, as progressive communities and people that really care about fashioning solutions that work for everybody, need to get in front of that by understanding how this is really just fueling tensions that create wedges between coalitions, which really undermine our causes.